successive NDCs, and these NDCs need to reflect the highest possible ambition and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. So we obviously know each country has different circumstances, different needs and responsibilities when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. So the NDCs are meant to reflect those individual country needs. And then all of the countries need to assess and ramp up their climate pledge on a regular schedule about every 5 years. Some of that is to be determined, but these are really the core of the Paris Agreement. So when you think about what does the Paris Agreement mean, how do we actually implement these goals to limit global temperature rise, all of that happens through these climate pledges, the NDCs. There's a lot of work to be done on the NDCs here in the US and around the world. So that is what we're going to be chatting about today. So these NDCs or climate pledges take a lot of different forms. You are looking at the presentation slides right now. On the left is the last US NDC, which was submitted in 2015. And the US NDC was a very short document, really only a couple pages of content, and it just says that the US commits to 26 to 28% emissions reductions by 2025 and 80% by 2050, which we know is not enough, but providing it here is an example of what one of these climate pledges can look like. In the US's case, it's just a super short document that's really just focused on what that number is when it comes to emissions reductions. And then if you are looking at your screen, on the right is an excerpt from the NDC for Chile. Chile submitted their latest pledge in 2020, and it's like a 50+ page document. It's quite comprehensive. It talks about many different intersecting issues within climate change. It ties everything into the sustainable development goals. It talks about how to implement this climate action in coordination with the general public, with community groups. And all of this is not to say that this pledge is perfect or is doing enough, but it's an example of what a more comprehensive climate action pledge looks like from a country. So we have sort of this range when we're looking at these national pledges. Some countries are like the US, and they are super brief, don't have a lot of information about how the country is actually going to achieve their goals. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have countries like Chile who are putting together very robust plans for climate action in the coming years. So to dive deeper into why this matters right now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the UN climate negotiations, which were set to occur in 2020, got postponed due to COVID-19. And right now, they are currently scheduled for this November to take place in the UK. However, there's still a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen with that. And this is important because due to COVID-19 and the postponement of these negotiations, a lot of countries have used that to their advantage to stop being transparent and involving the general public in the decisions they are making about their climate action plans. Countries were supposed to submit new pledges by the end of 2020, and many countries did, but many countries still have not. Like the US has not yet submitted their new pledge, and we will get more into that later, but there are still many countries that have not improved their pledge to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and halt the climate crisis. And I'm sure many of you have seen this image before. We have the climate action tracker thermometer up on the screen, and it's a projection of what global temperature increase is going to be by 2100, and current policies set us on track for about 3 degrees Celsius warming, well above the 1.5 degrees we need to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. So right now, countries' action plans, their pledges are not enough to do what we need to stop the climate crisis. And there's a lot we need to do this year to hold countries accountable for their plans and push them to be more transparent and more inclusive of the general public, especially with all of these delays due to COVID-19. So again, this matters because we are nowhere near on track for 1.5 degrees Celsius, and there are many challenges with COVID-19 and other intersecting crises we are facing right now. Countries all have different roles to play, and high emitter countries like the US are not doing their part. They're taking advantage of COVID-19 to reduce transparency and public participation. If you're looking at the screen, you can see at the bottom we have pictures from the last UN climate negotiations in 2019, and since that time, reduce transparency because no one has been able to meet in person. We also need actual measures of success and accountability. We need grassroots-driven action. We need countries to be held accountable to their people and to the world, because the Paris Agreement is not enough alone. It doesn't, countries, there are no enforcement mechanisms. The UN can't force countries to meet these goals. So we really need grassroots advocacy to make this happen. And we need to set up actual measures of accountability. And, people like all of you are already leading local efforts for just and ambitious climate solutions. And we need our governments to be responsive to that and support those efforts instead of creating unambitious goals and not working hard to achieve those goals on climate change. We also obviously have many intersecting needs when it comes to environmental justice and equity, and countries are not currently meeting these needs. Even the Paris Agreement says that countries need to consider their obligations on issues like human rights, public health, the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, young people, women, and girls. And obviously there are other important environmental justice needs, like addressing environmental racism and economic injustice within countries. So we need to do more than just meeting the Paris Agreement and actually go beyond, have people-led climate solutions. And people obviously suffering the most from the impacts of climate change did not cause this problem, and high emitter countries need to take responsibility for their role in this crisis. And right now, many countries like the US in their existing climate pledges are still centering people in power. And so we need to demand differently. And we need central focuses on human rights, racial, gender, economic justice, adaptation, and loss and damage, or funding to the countries and communities most impacted by climate change, provided by those responsible for climate change. And we need protections for young generations like ourselves and for future generations. And countries aren't meeting these targets right now. Most countries in their climate pledges do not mention women and girls, for example, including almost every high emitter country makes no reference to gender equality and justice. Many countries don't mention public health as an important component of addressing climate change, which is obviously necessary to address COVID-19 and other crises we are facing as well. So there's a lot we need to do to continue to make progress internationally on climate change and ensure these pledges are actually addressing climate change in a human first and comprehensive way. And there are a lot of different tools for tracking some of these justice and equity issues in the climate pledges, which we will talk more about in a bit, a way we all here can help participate in that. And here in the US specifically, we need to think about what it means to do our fair share in climate change. Obviously, the US government, all of our leaders and people in power, the fossil fuel industries causing this crisis have huge obligations to us and to the countries around the world we have impacted through our high emissions and colonialism. So up on the screen, you will see a US fair share target. This was put together by folks at the US Climate Action Network, and it suggests that the US fair share of greenhouse gas emissions is 5 million metric tons at home and 9 billion around the world. So what this means is that the US needs to reduce our own emissions by 70% by 2030 and support countries around the world in achieving emissions reductions goals. Obviously, our high emissions are negatively impacting the world as a whole. And so the US has a responsibility to provide funding and support to other countries who are not responsible for this crisis. So this is just an example of what it might mean for the US to play its fair part in the whole puzzle of addressing climate change as a planet. And this is a very ambitious emissions reduction goal. We think the US is likely to commit to 50% by 2030, and that's what many big green organizations and public officials are asking for. But we know in order to really do our fair part, we need to do more than that. And then before we jump into some discussion as a group, just want to highlight a focus on intergenerational equity. That's what Care About Climate does a lot of work on within all of these intersecting environmental justice and equity needs. But we know current leaders are making decisions that are going to impact our generations, millennials and Gen Z, and future generations. Other countries have pathways for youth participation in international climate policy. For example, like Norway and the Netherlands have a whole comprehensive process. Chile just created a new process for having young people involved in some of this decision making. So we need young people to have opportunities to make these decisions for ourselves. We need access to education, to good paying quality jobs. And there are a lot of different ways we can do this, but we know when the US makes its climate pledge, they're unlikely to mention or make considerations for young people. And we really need young people to lead the way on this, because these decisions are going to predominantly impact us. And so, for example, the NDC partnership of the UN suggests that countries need to support youth getting involved in this development process, in implementing projects. So there's a lot we can do to address this intergenerational inequity. And that's what we are going to have a discussion about today, is what we can do as young people to start to make a difference on these national climate pledges.
Cool. Thanks, Sydney. Before we go into some of these discussion questions, I'm going to actually stop sharing. And does anyone have any questions about anything that Sydney mentioned, or like what's happening this week with the Biden Climate Summit, or anything along those lines, just so that we can clarify things before we go into discussions?
Yes, and as you said that, Natalie, I will actually jump in. Yes, I did not dive too much into why this is relevant this week in particular. Obviously, we're excited that the convergence is happening, but we think the US is going to release its new pledge on the 22nd for Earth Day, in coordination with Biden's Leaders Climate Summit. So the US is going to provide that number. What's our emissions reduction percentage by 2030? And we hope will include some of these intersecting environmental justice and equity needs, but that remains to be seen. But this is very pertinent right now. It's a great opportunity for us to work together as young people to advocate for a better pledge than we are likely to see come out this week.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Biden has invited 40 countries, and only one represents like small island states, and there's only a few developing nations that are actually coming to the conversation. So it's mostly just like large developed or countries that are talking about like all the great things that they're planning on doing, but not really centering those who have been most impacted. So today we wanted to have a conversation, and if you don't mind turning on cameras, that would be cool, because then I think we get a little bit more engagement from that. Oh, look, faces. This is so wonderful. And we can also, like, once we actually start talking, if you could say like your name and where you're from, like as we begin the discussion, just kind of so that we can meet each other, that would be cool too, because I'm sad we don't get to do all this in person. But I guess today we wanted to talk about, so we gave all these numbers to you, and in some ways the numbers, I don't really want to say this, but in some ways the numbers don't matter, right? Like the idea is we just need to we need to draw down carbon emissions as quickly as possible and make sure that we're actually doing everything that we can and everything in our power to make sure that this crisis is stopped. And the federal government, frankly, isn't and cannot do it on its own. And so today we wanted to have more of a conversation about like, what does that mean for like local communities and for what you all are doing at home, and how does that actually work? Because to really bring down climate emissions in the way that we're talking about, you need deep systematic change, right? Like everything from transportation to energy to sorry, my cat is attacking me, to agricultural practices, to landscaping, housing, urban planning, etc. So it's a lot bigger of a conversation than we're making it out to be. And here, anyway, sorry about this. So I guess like and as youth activists, we have a really important voice because like in a lot of ways, we don't get bogged down by what is realistic or what is like able to happen under like boxes that like that society has constructed. We have the opportunity to decide what those boxes look like and paint them different colors and even make them different shapes. So wanted to talk a little bit about like, what does that look like in your community, and how are you all going about this, and how are we gonna all bring it down so that like we can actually make sure we get to a point where we collectively are reaching the 70% goal with or without the federal government doing it, because it's likely gonna be up to us. So I guess just going into that and thinking, so like, I guess the question that we have to start off with is, what can we do as young people to build power for international and transformative climate action? So that's a big question given everything that we said, but I wonder if anybody has any initial thoughts that they like were sparked with while listening to this, or thinking about like everything else that's been going on in the convergence so far. And I guess if you want to be in stack, you can either raise your hand with the reaction, you can type in the thing like a hand or stack. I would not use like little asterisks or like pluses, because usually I just think that you're agreeing with somebody or you're pushing their thoughts up. So yeah, hand, stack, or like raising hands would be good. Cool, thank you. So the question again is, what can we do as young people to build power for international and transformative climate action? And I will put it in the chat. Yeah. Yeah, Bria.
Oh, thank you. Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Bria Crawford. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am currently working in the Office of Water with the EPA. And so one thing when I kind of think about this question is more so networking. So events like this, as well as trying to reach out to people. Oftentimes it seems as if internationally everyone has their own thought about what's going on in other countries. And so we make all of these different assumptions. And I realized that a couple of weeks ago when someone from London interviewed me, and she was talking about, oh, I'm kind of afraid of coming to the US. It seems like all of these things are, going wrong. And from what I'm seeing on TV, it seems a little scary. And so how can we, like talk to people and try and break those assumptions and say, like, no, this is the things that we have going on here are also going on in other places as well. So I would just say, of course, just talking and sharing what we learned here, creating that network and seeing what other people need, and if they have information that we can bring back here as well, or information that we can help them with things going on. Yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Thanks. So we'll go to Jordana and then Amelia afterwards. I hope I'm pronouncing your names right. Go ahead.
You got mine right. My name is Jordana, and I live in South Florida, like a location especially that's going to be impacted by the climate crisis. And locally, some initiatives that we've done is like build coalitions and like have days where we mass call our local congressmen and women. So like that's something that can create an impact because it gets the conversation rolling nationally. And then for the international scale, it would be further along the line of continuing that effort on a larger scale.
Thanks. Amelia?
Hi, yeah. My name's Amelia. I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland right now. I think something that really like changed my perspective on international sort of emissions reduction is the idea of like the zero growth model and the focus on community sustainability as the real be all end all. And that's something Bill McKibben has talked about extensively throughout his life. And I think it's really important as young people that we get involved in our city politics, our city emissions goals, and in just creating like self-sufficient systems, whether it's a composting loop with a community garden or a community solar project for green energy. So I think that's something that's a little bit conflicting with some of the really empowering work that's been done by Sunrise and other groups. It's all about sort of like green jobs, green growth. But I don't know, I would love if someone could respond to that and has any ideas on how to sort of energize people around green growth, but also acknowledge that we, as young people, maybe shouldn't be striving for economic growth all the time.
I really love that, but I see other hands. So I'm going to see if there's other responses and then I can respond later. Hannah and then Amanda can go next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Kay. I use she, they pronouns. I'm the youth organizer at Real Climate, which is a climate justice organization in Southern Oregon. So I'm in Phoenix, Oregon. And we just had a devastating fire in our area, which burnt down 2 whole cities. And we're really rebuilding our community right now. But at our organization, like I said, I'm a youth organizer, and we have a team called the Rogue Climate Action Team, which are all youth. So we have an internship program that usually sees around 10 to 13 students, youth from age 14 to 35. And then we bring those youth into our action team. And then these youth are the ones creating campaigns. So they've worked on stop natural gas campaigns at a local level, very local. So right now I'm creating kind of working groups for our youth to help them get empowered to push local governments for clean energy, solar panels. Oregon's a little different. We don't get a lot of sun, so we have to figure out other ways. And wind is also a potential thing, but we're also really trying to think about that. And it's a lot of youth doing the research with support from our team and me to help empower them to do those things. So our organization, we're really focused on that youth development piece. So if other folks have that capacity to be able to work with youth or interns, I think that that's a really great way to start empowering youth to get involved with that. So I said local action. We're now getting more involved with state action, but I really, I think state can feel very overwhelming. So local action is also a really great way to go. Yeah, I'll stop talking, but that's just some thoughts from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Hannah. Amanda and then Mackenzie.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Rodriguez, she, her pronouns. I'm with Sustain Us, which is a U.S. Youth for Global Climate Justice and Sustainability, and also the Climate Reality Project, so my day job. But so thank you everybody who shared already, and like kind of in contrast to what you just shared, Hannah. I think something that comes up for me a lot in my work is trying to keep Americans to remember that like the rest of the world exists and like is impacted by what happens in our country. And a lot of times I've found that some people get so focused on US advocacy that they don't make the intersection with how the US, like the fair share, or like how we are so responsible to the rest of the world and to the global south, and how our actions at home have such a big impact abroad. So everywhere you go, just like always kind of double checking, like how is this affecting our friends abroad? Like what is the impact of this? What are people in the global south like actually calling for, and making sure that you are like, you have to really go out of your way to find out what that is, because you wouldn't really like find it in your day-to-day as an American person here. So that would definitely be my one thing. Like with Sustain Us, the way I got involved was doing advocacy at the World Bank annual meeting. So the United States is one of the largest shareholders of the World Bank, and that's just one of the institutions that does foreign aid. So, making sure that at least, like, of all the problematic things that the World Bank does, at least that they're not continuing to finance fossil fuels, because obviously we should advocate for that at home and abroad, because that is also our tax money going to those fossil fuel infrastructure abroad. So working with the communities who are on the ground in those countries opposing the projects, but also kind of bringing that those voices and that advocacy back to, you know, DC or to wherever that is, I found has really helped to like keep that lens, and it just makes it a lot stronger when you have people across continents kind of advocating for the same thing. So in other spaces, I found that I'm like, hey guys, remember, like, we're just not just America here. Like, let's kind of like get an international lens. So that would definitely just be my tip, and like being that advocate, because obviously you might find yourself in a space where it's like all people from the United States or all people from just the global north, and remembering that to check in and to like kind of hold yourselves accountable to people in the global south has been like the best way for me. So
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. And then Mackenzie, and then we'll go to Harry.
Everyone, thanks so much for the feedback and the interesting perspectives that you brought so far. I wanted to build on Bria's point. Oh, first, sorry, I'm Mackenzie. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm currently a legal intern with the Center for International Environmental Law in DC. And I wanted to build on Bria's point about networking and Hannah's point about organization and internship potential. I wouldn't be in the internship role that I'm currently in without the advocacy of a previous intern who came before me and really pushed for payment for interns in the organization in which I'm currently working. It would not have worked. I have a lot of student debt and I grew up below the poverty line. So it's just impossible for me to get into the climate space without some financial assistance. And I think if you find yourself in a position where you have an in, where the door has been opened for you, you need to advocate on behalf of other people who don't have the same opportunity. So using the networks that you're building to strengthen those opportunities for other people to come in is really valuable. And in terms of increasing space for people with diverse perspectives and people with diverse backgrounds, that's really valuable. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Harry?
Hey, everyone. My name's Harry. Any pronouns all right. I do some volunteering with Sunrise Movement in Seattle. And I really resonate with Amanda's comment before about how like there's so much wonderful work going on domestically, I think, in the US climate movement. But a lot of times like the international component and international solidarity kind of gets forgotten. And like I think personally, I've definitely been a part of that. Like I've only recently learned about how important international climate finance is, and like you all were discussing before in the presentation about how the US actually has to help poorer countries invest in clean energy because a lot of developing countries just can't afford to do that right now. And like how we can't stop climate change unless the US sort of provides a huge amount of funding to other countries to help them fight climate change too. So I guess like that's the main reason why I wanted to come to this presentation, is like I'm really interested to hear more about like what's going on nationally with that right now, and like what the decision makers are and the deadlines, and like how we can sort of do our part and influence that process. But I guess just a few ideas off the top of my head, like speaking as an individual, are like I think there's been some really interesting campaigns to get local governments to provide money to international climate finance. Like I know the Seattle City Council passed a resolution sort of saying that we do our part to contribute to the Green Climate Fund, which is like how the US, one of the ways the US is supporting poorer countries to fight climate change. And I think also demanding that our members of Congress make appropriations to the Green Climate Fund might be a part of it too. And also I think this is maybe a little separate, but also related, is like demanding that Biden stop the drug companies from like right now the drug companies are hoarding the vaccine recipes and not letting poorer countries have those, which is just like vastly constraining how fast the vaccines can roll out and like depriving millions of people in poorer countries of vaccines. And I think like that's hugely impacts us as climate advocates too, because first of all, like it's prolonging the pandemic and like wrecking poorer countries' economies, just hurting their ability to invest in climate action even more. And also, like, obviously prolonging the pandemic really weakens the climate movement. And it also weakens the like international solidarity that we need to fight the climate crisis more than ever right now. So I think maybe like fighting for the Biden administration to do the right thing on that might be part of it too. Those are just some thoughts.
Awesome. And thanks for the engagement immediately. This is a really great group. It's always fun to do presentations and then no one wants to talk. So I love this. Okay, so I heard a couple of different things and I'd like to explore a bunch of it, right? So first off, I think there's a lot more elements of like both and instead of this either or thinking that we could incorporate a little bit more too. So like, for example, the reason, so I'm from Flagstaff, Arizona. The reason I got involved in the climate movement was because my hometown was like under threat of fire every year. We were put on evac notice like multiple times. And then right after the fires happened came floods because there was no trees to stop the rain that came from the monsoons. Like, so I started getting involved in that and thinking about like, okay, what can I do? And then I went into campus and then I was like, what can I do here? And so then we started thinking about like, okay, well, we can do composting programs and community garden and like actually start building out energy initiatives and like trying to move our campus away from natural gas. And then it became more of a and then I also started getting involved with in 2012 is when I went to my first UN climate negotiation. So I'm almost 30 now, which is like kind of terrifying. But I also started to care about climate when I was 23. But the point is, I think what I really resonated with when it came to the international stuff was because there are people around the world going through similar issues that like people think are their issues, but it really happens in the US too. And for example, we have islands in Alaska that like Shifmaref that are literally falling into the ocean right now. And they voted to leave that island and don't have the money to actually rebuild anywhere else. We have, speaking of Florida, we have folks who are in a situation where like the rich hotels and people who have beachfront property are now looking into like more inside the city and are now doing like climate gentrification so that they can be where the where people will want to be when the sea levels rise. Like it's fascinating and it's happening other places and we don't really talk about what's happening here. So like the losses and damages, that's a term that like a lot of international policy wonks use, are happening just as much here as they are in other countries, except we don't talk about it in the same way. I mean, if you go onto the Navajo reservation, the amount of people that don't have plumbing and then now are experiencing drought and their wells are drying up is pretty remarkable. And so thinking about this is like a collective struggle where we're all trying to look for liberation and like resisting like this like capitalist oppressive state that we're in just constantly, and thinking about like what the possibilities could be and kind of thinking about what like Mackenzie was thinking about, like advocating for what we all should have the right to have, I think is really important. And then I want to finally bring in Amelia's point, thinking about like this green growth concept, because like it all starts at home, right? Like the stuff that happens in our backyard affects us way more than the stuff that happens like way down the road. And the reason that bad things have happened is because we create sacrifice zones, right? Like there are like if we didn't sacrifice poor and Black and brown bodies, then like a lot of the coal-fired power plants and like the environmental waste and different like polluting sites wouldn't have been made in the first place because white people wouldn't have allowed it, right? So there's a lot of intersections here that I think I just wanted to flag because I really appreciate thinking about like, so what are we doing as this global community? So I just wanted to tie all this together because I think what you all were saying is all on the same track and moving towards the same way. And I think we can think about like how our local action really takes us to this place where we can actually reduce our emissions to be able to make change. Because if we don't have it locally, we're going to be in a bad spot. So I guess just kind of like going through now moving to kind of Harry's point is I want to go through like what the calendar is this year of big things that are happening internationally and places we can plug in and who the people are who are in charge. I didn't prep this, so Sydney, you're gonna have to like help me with it. So we'll kind of tag team on it. So this Thursday is the Biden Climate Summit. As mentioned, there are going to be 40 countries that have been invited, and large emitters are going to be submitting their climate pledges, including us, Australia, Brazil, South Korea, Japan, I think the UK, and are there any other big ones that I'm missing, Sydney, that will be dropping their thing? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm not sure, but yes, those are the big ones. I'll also pop a link in the chat to this about all the countries that are coming. But yeah.
Okay, so we have all that happening, and like the dynamics are really fascinating, right? So like everyone, basically the goal for the big greens is to get to 50% reductions by 2030 and get this like 50% club, but we need more than 50% in order to build like the movements that we actually need and to reduce emissions in the way that we need to. So they're starting that conversation, and then there's also additional conversations going on about like rainforest protection, specifically around Brazil, which Brazil has been Brazil's been really bad to indigenous people, like specifically recently with Bolsonaro. And they've been like destroying the forest. So there's some political stuff going on too, in that like we don't want Biden to be endorsing Bolsonaro's bad actions for all the stuff he's been doing. I'm getting too into the weeds, but like this stuff is important at the same time. So we have that. They'll be announcing the NDCs, and then throughout the year, countries will be bringing through their NDCs. Care About Climate is going to be doing a project where we are going to be doing NDC analysis when people put out theirs from an equity lens. So if y'all are interested in getting involved with that, we'll be doing that and connecting with people in country to critique their own country stuff. So we're thinking about that. And then there are a couple other big events that are happening this year, in theory, unless canceled by COVID. There's the G7, which is going to be a large event, and I think that's happening in the summer. There is the Petersburg Climate Dialogues, which is being hosted by Germany and is supposed to have pretty large financial implications, specifically coming from the German government, because Merkel is about to transition out, which is like an interesting thing because she's been in power for a really long time, and Germany has been a huge advocate on climate action. And then we have, there's a 3-week long session in like May to June-ish, or like end of May, I'm talking about, to June. That is the subsidiary bodies for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they'll be talking a lot about markets in that situation. And then in September, we'll have like New York Climate Week. And then in November will be the UN climate negotiations. So there's those things that are happening. And then so that's internationally the climate stuff, and that's only the climate stuff. And you have a bunch of things happening around world trade, and all of this is intersectional, right? Then we have what's happening in the US. which there's a lot of political moments about around the infrastructure bill and the Thrive agenda. And there's a couple of different, I'm not as actually up to date on all those things, and it would probably be good for you all to go. There's sessions that are happening throughout PowerShift that like will be specifically on those. And those are opportunities for large amounts of finance, which we haven't seen since basically the Green New Deal. They're not calling it a Green New Deal, but the amount of money that is passing through it is pretty comparable to the New Deal. And it's supposed, and the way that Biden is using it as a tool is to create systematic changes to what the US infrastructure in our world looks like. And at the same time, it won't be enough because, and it's coming from a state that's centered in like a lot of traditional values of capitalism and white supremacy and protecting businesses at the same time. So that's what movements are for, and that's what we're here for. I hope, I'm sorry I talked a lot, but hopefully that was like sort of helpful as an overview. I also just really quickly wanted to go over the youth climate demand. So Sydney and I had been working with PowerShift network organizations to put together the youth climate demands, which I'm going to put into the chat right now. Everyone. Okay. But I'm also going to share my screen. So a lot of this session, and I want us to have another discussion, but it's about like, how do we take back power and make this narrative ours so that we can like make the change that needs to happen in the world, right? So we have released these climate demands essentially to be able to ask for the amount of stuff that we actually need in order to be able to have the economy and the infrastructure and everything that we want to see in our future. So we want to do a reduction of 75 emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2040. I will say there have been critiques about the net zero language, and I am aware of them. And if I could take it back now, probably would. And so we need to wrestle with that as like a movement, because net zero, it means that you can usually buy off your responsibility to emit, and you're allowed to still pollute while pushing it on to others. So I just want to flag that that is an issue, and I think that's something that like we're all learning about. But actually deploying financial resources to the communities to enable a just transition and economic justice, and I think that's what Harry and Amanda are talking about. And then recognizing and uplifting BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, and phasing down fossil fuel production and supply, which, like, obviously, if you're trying to take on climate action seriously, continuing to build like pipelines is not a great idea. So these are the youth climate demands, and you can share them and with folks that you know. And this is kind of like a launch and a building block to something bigger that we can hopefully all work together on to be able to move that forward. Yeah, so I'm gonna stop talking for a little bit. Reb, I do see your question, and I can put some stuff in the chat about it because I don't want to, I feel like I'm taking up a lot of space. But I guess, like, do people have reactions or thoughts, or we could even go back to the question of like, what can we do as young people to build power for international and transformative climate action? Like, that was the initial question. So like, how do we all work together to make sure that happens at a local, state, national, and international level? Reb, go ahead.
Yeah, you all talk about like 70% by 2030, but that doesn't feel like enough at all. Like that, even with that, there's like almost no chance of like staying below 1.5 degrees warming, and it's just it's just gonna be terrible. So it's just like I feel like we need even more drastic measures. Like Extinction Rebellion's target is net zero by 2025, which is like it is really extreme, but it's like what's necessary to really like make sure we stop major disasters.
Yeah, thanks for that, Reb. And I want to say that they're probably in actually similar levels. So the 70% is in addition to another 125% that we owe the world to help them bring down their emissions. So it's a call to action for the US to not only take care of our home and our crap, but then to also provide resources for others so that they don't have to go through what we did. So instead of building coal-fired power plants and natural gas plants, like how can we just leapfrog you to renewable energy? Or like how can we make sure that you don't feel like you need to exploit your forest in order to be able to stop climate change? So I think we're on the same level. I think we're just trying to put more of the onus on the US to help the rest of the world, because that's like these are our historical emissions. So we owe more than 100% basically of just our stuff. Yeah, and then I think net zero is also just like something that we could probably talk a little bit more about. And it's because the way net zero has been done in the past, it just, like it's been like basically large countries have been like, I can continue to pollute the same. And if I just say, oh, I'm helping this country over here keep their emissions down by like doing something that isn't super effective, like it doesn't actually make you bring your emissions down, which can then lead to double counting. There's a lot of other problems with it. So I think net zero isn't like the worst. It's just been like the way that it's been implemented in the communities that have been impacted are still like, it's still an environmental justice issue, and it still ends up on the backs of like, even when you have net zero, you're still building coal-fired power plants, for example. You're just offsetting them somewhere else, which is the problem. Amelia, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, do you know could you describe some of the pathways that as individuals, young progressive people like us can actually get into the table and into these discussions about the NDCs, whether there's any sort of like insider path or whether it just has to be done through outside or affinity group organizing?
I think it's both. Like Sunrise put themselves in the like conversation because they did exceptional outsider organizing as an example. And I would say Care About Climate does the other way of organizing, which is doing like literally insider methods. And neither are wrong, but it just is different theories of change, and we're all pushing, we're letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and so it's all good. And I would say, like for us, we work in a lot of networks, and that has led us to be able to get into high places. So we work a lot with Power Shift Network, which is how we develop the youth climate demands. And I help coordinate that group, and hopefully we'll continue to do international work on like mobilizing our domestic side to do international action. So there's that. You can also attend the UN conferences with either Sustain Us, Care About Climate. Who else goes? There's a couple universities that send students. Sierra Student Coalition has sent students in the past. So there are orgs that actually like do some of this like inside track stuff. And then we also work a lot with United States Climate Action Network. So like Sydney and I have had talks with like folks who are on Carrie's team, and are able to like directly input into like what they're thinking and saying, which is really nice. And so it's like, relationships is really like the only key that I have for you. And getting to know people who know people is like all I can recommend. But the thing is, like, that's cool about Power Shift is now you know people. And so if you're interested in getting involved with this, and Cindy runs our policy program, so you could just join her team. We can start bringing you into meetings. I mean, it's pretty easy, actually. If you do the work and show up, people are pretty excited to have you. Sydney?
Yes, I will just quickly add that, yeah, here in the US, like the NDC is run through Gina McCarthy's team and John Kerry's team in coordination. So it's challenging in that these are not like our members of Congress. Like the direct grassroots lobbying is a lot more difficult. So yes, it's a challenge. That's why we have these youth climate demands. Like I encourage signing and sharing, and also us using this opportunity when we see the new pledge come out to compare to what we want to see, what we've all talked about today and what has actually come out. But yes, just in agreement with everything Natalie has said in that we're all figuring it out. Like it can be a very insider pathway, and like public officials and like very well established, old environmental organizations have really dominated this discussion for a long time. So we're trying to find a new pathway. And so everything you all are doing is helping, but it is a challenge.
Yeah, and Amanda just put the Twitter for Sustain Us. And I'd recommend you do follow them. They're really powerful actors when it comes to like these large meetings and being able to get a lot of press. Do you want to say anything on that, Amanda?
Yeah, I just wanted to share. We've been working, kind of doing that inside support for the Fair Shares NDC. So with the understanding that, like we said, 50% is not anywhere close to what we need to do. So Sustain Us has been working with some other groups that are also pushing for a higher emissions reduction in the NDC, such as ActionAid International is a really great one, Friends of the Earth, Corporate Accountability, etc. So all of these groups are also helping to push for much stronger domestic action, to be supportive. Center for Biological Diversity is another one. Yeah, absolutely. So I would recommend following all of those accounts as well, and ours. So just so you can definitely make sure to hear that perspective as well, especially this week as the NDC announcement comes out and the summit happens. If you're looking for that more like progressive perspective on things, I would definitely recommend those organizations and Sustain Us.
Yeah. And then as we start, like, so the NDC is going to launch, there's a panel on Friday of like Global South youth who are going to be reacting to the NDC that like a couple of folks have been putting together, including, I saw someone mention the International Student Environmental Coalition. I think that was Hannah. So there's a couple of people who will be commenting on that from a Global South perspective. And then like basically the NDC's gonna come out, and then we have a lot of work to do, y'all, because it's not gonna be enough. And we do live in a global community, and we do have the power to change what's going on. That's super clear from like even the Biden administration and how pressured they feel about it all. Like it's pretty amazing what kind of things we can do. So if y'all are interested too, after this week, we can also come together and we can put our emails in the chat and everything, but we can come together and think about, okay, so like what's next? And maybe I really appreciated like Harry's question, and Sydney actually chatted me about this, but we could also go into like, maybe we should power map the different people who are in positions in the US, think about like what actually needs to happen to get there. Think about this like local, what does like actually local green growth look like? And what models can be used across the country to help achieve that? And how do we decarbonize, bring good jobs, and create the future that we want. And how do we own that narrative so that people can't take that from us and they can't, well, they'll try, but like, how do we make it so that we are really in charge of what happens next, sort of thing, I think is important. Does anyone else have any thoughts or feedback or like things that they'd like to add to this discussion? So what are you all gonna do? Thursday's gonna happen. They're gonna come out with something. It's gonna not be the thing that we need. So what are you all doing? What's happening Friday or next week? Yeah, Reb, what's going on?
We're doing an action by the White House on Thursday morning. So we're gonna bring piles of manure to say that 50% emissions by 2030 is bullshit, because that's not gonna do anything. So it'll be a pretty cool action. Yeah.
That's amazing. What else are y'all doing? It could also be, what are you doing after? It doesn't have to be related to the Biden summit, but like, what are we doing to like build the momentum we need in order to solve this problem?
I'm hoping to do some more connection at an international level with the youth that I work with. I mean, there's people within the organization that I work with that already have those connections. But if people already have those, I mean, we just listed some ideas, but I'm happy to connect later with my youth, because I know that they would be really excited about it. So that's what I would like to do next.
Cool. And we're really involved with CAN International, the Climate Action Network International, and then also YOUNGO, which is the youth NGOs of the UN climate conference, basically. So I put my email in the chat, and then Sydney can put hers too, I think. And then you can email us and bother us, and we would be happy to connect people. What else are y'all gonna do? I think it could be cool to have like a real conversation, a deep one, about what Amelia brought up around like, what is green growth and how do we actually like think about what it will take for our communities to like bring people together to build the communities that we need in order to have a sustainable climate. Yeah, Sydney?
Yeah, I really like that idea. And yeah, something I'm doing next week in my community is like trying to paint like a Colorado portrait with groups here in my state about, yes, what would it mean for us to actually, our communities to actually thrive here, and like, what is our place, you know, as interacting communities within the state, within the country, within the world. So I like what you all have mentioned today. I think there's a lot we can do to start to build this out and do that both and with, we've got to be localized and also think about the global picture. So I'm excited by what you all are doing and have suggested.
Yeah, Bria?
Oh, yeah, I think everything everyone's talking about has been pretty interesting. I find one thing that I'm having difficulty with is I lived in Oakland for 5 years, and I felt like there was such a strong sense of community and activism and environmental justice. And so I literally I lived in DC before, but I'm in Maryland, and I relocated at the beginning of the pandemic. So literally 2 weeks into lockdown, and I'm still trying to figure out, besides work, like where I fit in. So right now I'm pretty much just networking, trying to find organizations and seeing what a lot of people are doing and what a lot of my friends are doing. And then within work, I'm trying to really, I mean, it's hard because I am working for the government and I am just starting out, but I am trying to push more of the climate change and environmental justice agenda, and pretty much just trying to attend all of these conferences. I've been attending like town meetings for different states and just seeing what's going on. So community wise, I would say having virtual town hall meetings, even though I haven't been on any here in like DC, Maryland, I've been on some for like the Rocky Mountains, the West Coast, the Gulf Coast. And I think holding those meetings has been pretty influential in just seeing how there's so many resources out there, but a lot of communities don't have access to them. And so if, you know, people can possibly bring together people with town halls or public meetings, then you can see what the different organizations are doing and how you can share those resources. So that that's something pretty cool that I've just been kind of finding here and there wherever I, you know, fit in.
Thanks, Bria. I think that's awesome. I also really appreciate the idea of like how we bring communities together and really think about this on a community level. Because you also have to meet people where they're at too, right? Like, and our communities, I mean, I live in Cleveland, Ohio. And I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I couldn't think of two more different places. So it's also like thinking about, okay, like what does a smaller mountain town need versus like a huge metropolitan area that has a ton of history, ton of vacant buildings. It takes a long time to get across the city. Like it's a totally different situation. There's a lot of rural areas. And how do you bring all these people together to like really make sure that you are creating a future that like is bold and everyone can get onto? And I really like the idea of like doing that as a community and finding your people to like be able to make these changes with. Any other thoughts from folks? Yeah, Mackenzie.
Thanks. I am a singer-songwriter as well as a jurist. So I recently won a songwriting competition on a song that I wrote about how angry and frustrated I am about climate change. And I'm a little, the way that they reproduced the song is a little bit Disney. It's a little bit Colors of the Wind, and I'm not super jazzed about it, but they're still lending me a platform to release the song on Earth Day and put it out on their social media channels. So I'm hoping to use that for my Instagram and to be able to spark conversations based on it. I think the lyrical content is still good, even if the production quality is a little cheesy and not exactly the direction I would have gone. But I'm really excited to have an artistic statement piece that I can put out there and use it as a springboard, because the tone of the song is very angry and does demand more of the generations which preceded us. So I'm hoping to be able to talk about the NDC and how it falters and flops, and what we need to demand of our leaders in our country based on that, and have an artistic piece to move that forward. So I'm just hoping to engage with my Instagram following that way.
Did you put your handle in to the chat, or can you?
No, I didn't, but I will. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other folks that want to, we probably have to wrap up in a few minutes because this channel will be used for the gender breakout groups for PSN. But are there any other like last things that you all want to talk about, or like next steps forward, or anything that you want, like Sydney and I are happy to convene a conversation again and have broader, like maybe a broader discussion about like actions now that you know more about like the beginnings and the base of it and have met each other. We can make whatever you all want happen. I'm not sure. Is anyone interested in maybe doing that, coming back together and having more conversations? Yeah. Okay. And are you all part of the PowerShift network or part of the PowerShift Slack? Is anyone not? I guess is a better answer, or question, not answer. Okay. Cool. Then you can look out for an email / a message from Sydney and I, and and we'll try to convene somebody. Thank you for dropping that in the chat, Hannah. So if you're not part of the Slack, please join. A lot of cool things happen there. And I think, I can't remember who, sorry, everyone's been bringing up really great points. Someone brought up a point about networking and the importance of networks. And I swear that's like how half of the time I get work done. And so the more that we can do stuff together and allow each other access to power and spaces and like engage with one another, I think that's for the best. So I'm excited to keep talking with y'all. Cool. I need to follow Mackenzie on Instagram. Any other last questions or thoughts for the good of the order here? Okay, cool. Sydney, did I miss anything?
I don't think so, but yes, sign that petition, share it with folks, our youth climate demands, check it out. Yeah, and we'll keep an eye on what happens on Thursday. But I think if you are all signed up through Sketch, like I can send you all an email with like slides, recording, follow up if we want to chat more after the convergence. But that's all I have.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. It was really nice to meet you all, and hopefully we'll be seeing each other soon in the future. Bye.
Everyone.